Hello and welcome to the third of the webinar in advance of the Georgetown Global Dialogues in Rome, Italy in June. Today, I'm joined by Verónica Gago, Hisham Matar, Kohei Saito, all three Georgetown Global Dialogue Fellows. And we are going to be answering or trying to answer the question, how can solidarity be rebuilt after the failures of progressivism? Um, the assumption behind this question is that there is a crisis within progressivist movements. They are, I think you could argue, almost everywhere right now facing a historic defeat. They are in retreat. Um, that might be contested by the participants today in this discussion. But let me draw out some sort of working assumptions here, and then I'll turn to one of the panelists and ask them if they are correct. I would argue that the modern world is premised on the idea of empowerment, of individual empowerment, through use of reason and science. The idea being that human beings can build a heaven on earth rather than wait for it in the afterlife. Of course, the problem, which starts very early in the 19th century, is that this heaven on earth, this idea of it, soon becomes complicit in the project of industrial capitalism, which is all about endless growth and expansion. And of course, it doesn't really care for social bonds, any kind of community whatsoever. It's all about the accumulation of profit. So the old idea of heaven on earth in a secular mode that becomes more and more complicated as social bonds weaken, as the exploitation of the weak accelerates, inequality becomes more structured and more oppressive, and of course, a small plutocratic class begins to prosper. Now, the socialist tradition obviously emerged to fight this state of affairs. It drew upon Christian ideas and traditions of equality and justice and fraternity. And of course, it intended to soften, if not entirely overthrow, this brutal process of capitalism. But in one crucial respect, the left tradition did not depart from capitalism, which was it still upheld the idea of a better future, a heaven on earth indeed. What it did was it linked equality and justice and solidarity to a better future. So solidarity, for instance, came to depend on continuous material improvements so people could come together to build a better future for themselves. And again, there was this assumption of continual empowerment, both individual and collective. Today, of course, that future is in very serious doubt. Not only is the left in retreat, facing defeat on all fronts, there is really no big shared project of solidarity, of social solidarity. The project of empowerment itself seems to have led to too many um, individualists, selfish individualists, anarchists, nihilists who seek power simply in order to abuse it. So the question really is, can there be a different basis for social solidarity, something that is not built around an idea of continuous progress and empowerment, but on a feeling that many of us know very intimately of helplessness, of individual frailty. Lots of questions, but maybe I'll turn to Kohei to ask him whether he agrees with this diagnosis. And if not, what kind of different basis does he propose for social solidarity? Kohei, over to you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So I didn't agree with what you said 5 years ago, but now I think I have to agree, and I think we can think about the future only by recognizing this situation characterized by the end of progress. So 5 years ago, I published a book in Japanese, which is available now as Slow Down in English. And I presented basically that in order to fight against climate change and the crisis of capitalism, degrowth or degrowth communism based on Marxist idea of emancipation is the only solution. It sounded quite crazy, but yes, it became very popular in the middle of the pandemic, and the book sold quite well in Japan, and it was translated into many languages. I had some hope, you know. The pandemic was the moment when we recognized that the business as usual in the past created many problems, and this pandemic was the manifestation of all the contradictions, ecological disaster, economic inequality. And I hoped that after this experience, people learn and then they try to build a new future, and especially the coming bigger crisis of climate change compels everyone to recognize the urgency, and then this universality of the crisis, because it's planetary crisis, kind of creates the foundation for building new solidarity and so on. But obviously I was too optimistic. Many things happened. 2022 war in Ukraine, and then it was accompanied by inflation, accelerating economic inequality, and then the genocide in Gaza happened, and then the climate movement really kind of is gone. I live now in Germany, and then that's country where there's so many movements, but now it's really gone. And then what happened is basically last year, 2024, since we didn't do anything to decarbonize rapidly, 1.5 degrees Celsius target is over. Now it's too late to meet this target. And 2.0 is also hard. It's quite likely that by the end of the century, it's going to be 3.0, 3.5 or something, right? So this situation is characterized by continuous worsening of the situation, which is quite different from our Enlightenment modern thinking of unilinear progress, characterized by technological progress, economic growth, and we will always make progress. That's what always capitalists talk about. But of course, left-wing progressive people also talk about some kind of progress in the future. We have many problems, but in the future, if we implement this policy or if we do like a revolution or something, we can always have something better. So the crisis is actually also opportunity to build a better future. It's this negation of negation in the Hegelian way is quite characteristic. And I also use this logic, right? Climate crisis is the condition for creating degrowth communism, which is better than capitalism and so on. But maybe I was wrong. I mean, after overshooting this situation, we need a new narrative because it's too late to save everyone. It's the future will be a chronic emergency, chronic crisis, and then the future will be worse, more inflation, more conflicts, more natural disasters, and so on and so on. And then maybe we fight each other, more egoistic behaviors, and so on. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Verónica or Hisham criticize me and disagree, of course. But the situation, if you look at in an objective way, it's really increasingly quite bad. And I think only the possibility of rebuilding progressivism can start by recognizing this end of progress.
Verónica, do you agree with this description?
Well, I think that we have been part and we have witnessed different movements in the last decade that were part of a material concrete critique of the notion of progress in capitalist, colonial, and racist terms. So I think that when we can see different feminist, transfeminist, ecological, indigenous collectives and movements. They were, and they are still, but they were very vividly building up a way of doing, way of practicing politics and, yes, reorganizing the territories in a way that was against this idea of progress of capitalism. So I think that nowadays we are confronting a sort of counter-revolution against those kind of collectives, against those anti-progressivism, very much colonial and very much capitalist. So I think it is now that we have to reframe solidarity in this moment of war, in this moment of genocidal capitalism, because I think that this moment is also a response, a counter-revolution, and not only a backlash against those alternatives that were struggling against this notion of progress in capitalist terms. For example, talking from the Argentine experience, for example, our government nowadays, Milei, he represents a far-right vanguard, a sort of avant-garde of authoritarian experimentation against indigenous communities, against trans-feminist struggles, against the history of human rights and justice struggles in Argentina. So the war on gender, but also the war against universities, public education, the glorification of Israel destruction in Gaza, but also the repression against, for example, pensionate people and the way that they are criminalizing popular leaderships. I think that those elements are showing us how these authoritarian regimes are very faster developing in a fascist way. But I think that this fascist way is also, I insist, a response against movements and way of thinking beyond progress, beyond progressive capitalism. So, for example, the element of the chainsaw that Milei is well, doing as a sort of icon of his policies, I think it is not simply a metaphor. It is the concrete machine to destroy social bonds, to destroy territories, to destroy solidarities, and also a way to spectacularize violence. And I think that is also nowadays a sort of icon of an international politics of patriarchy, racism, plunder, and violence. And also talking about this idea of progress, it is not by chance, I think, that, for example, Milei's, but also other ultra-right-wing leaders, but specifically in Argentina, Milei is talking about financial freedom. So as a term of progress, he's promising, for example, through cryptocurrency and through speculation, this idea of a promise of a better future. And he's appealing especially to young people. And I think this is something that we have to discuss, how to, well, produce another kind of desire, another kind of well, way of doing politics for young people. And much of them are and were very much involved in other kinds of political experiments. And of course, there is a nexus between labor precarization and authoritarian politics. There is a nexus between, I think, how migrant people have reorganized the struggles around labor and how feminist and trans-feminist struggles have reframed the connection between sexual violence, racist violence, and capitalist violence. So what I want to say is that, to put it very briefly, that a lot of struggles that are being nowadays confronted are part of a sort of counter-imaginary of progress in capitalist term.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Veronica, but it's interesting that this idea that Milei, for instance, is promoting among his followers financial freedom. I think there is a very attractive idea there, especially attractive to young people, the idea of creating a self, creating an individuality through entrepreneurship, through consumption. And that's something, you know, obviously consumption-oriented capitalism is the most seductive ideology it offers to young people. But those of us who did not grow up in capitalistic societies, who grew up with a very different idea of social relations, a very different idea of even individuality, are often struck by this. But obviously, young people who have grown up in a very different world where this kind of individualism or this kind of construction of individuality has been the norm. It's been internalized. It's what is promoted by the culture. Um, they don't actually have any other means. So I think your proposal that people should be taught a different way of desiring is a really, I think, a compelling one. What is it that they should desire? What kind of ethic should be outlined? I mean, we don't really have clear answers to that. But I'm going to turn to Hisham now and ask him, because he's a novelist, and obviously in his work he's constantly dealing with simply the sort of incoherent nature of the human individual. I think it's the novel that makes clear that the construction of the individual, the human individual that is found in capitalism or other dominant ideologies of our times, is actually profoundly defective. That this rational individual who pursues his or her interest, self-interest, in this very rational way, deploying science, deploying reason, deploying all financial instruments of the kind Millet is offering. This model is a fantasy, actually, and the human individual is a very incoherent entity, full of contradictions, full of self-doubts, full of various full of a kind of constantly variable internal weather, where no belief, no conviction remains firm for too long, even if the public expressions of it are very strong. Internally, there's always some doubt about that. Um, this is very broad. This is a very broad question, Hisham. But do you think the novel as a form proposes an idea of the individual, which is essentially defining the individual as a weak person, not necessarily a strong person, someone who aspires for strength but is actually quite weak, and whether that weakness itself is a basis for feeling compassion and solidarity with other people who are equally weak, however much they might pretend to be strong.
And also a need for finding cohesion, for finding connections. There's a very when you said this, I remembered there's a moment in the 6th volume of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, where there's a character who is Bergotte, who's in the gallery, but he's dying. It's a very strange construction because he's expiring, and he looks at a painting, and he doesn't understand, how do you do this? How is it possible to create this kind of effect where something as bland as a yellow wall in a painting can move him? And he comes up with, or Proust comes up with, these 3 things that might be involved in the enterprise of creating a work of art. And it's they've always struck me as very curious things, right? Kindness, scrupulosity, and self-sacrifice. So apart from the middle one, which is to do with a kind of register of care or a register of being precise and scrupulous and exacting, the other 2 are interested in questions of a common ground, of seeing oneself, even in the solitary act of making a work of art, as being not only bound up with others, but actually involved in a sense of making something that is of a kind of something else that exists in the world. I think the kindness here is not just, it is, I think, meant as you know, in the sense of compassion, but it's also, I think, meant in the way that perhaps Shakespeare might have meant it, which is to make something of a kind, something that has another image out there in the world. So this question of coherence, of solidarity being one of the things that it's about, is an imaginative desire to see things as they seem to be, in fact, which is that we are very much co-reliant, that our fates are bound up with one another. Is something that I do, you know, that I do see in the work of making any work of art, not only just the novel. And I think one of the things that strikes me about this moment is that it's the sense of cohesion is terribly undermined by any kind of common ground or common language or even a common imagination, right? So there's a real bewilderment, I think, of the imagination when we think, for example, about any possibility of a future, what that future might look like. In a very short space of time, we stopped having fantasies of the future, even if the ones that we had before, some of them, in my view, are to be lamented, right? But nonetheless, there was at least a kind of language about the future that made its way into popular culture and in various conversations. And that seems to not be present right now, at least not in ways that are coherent. And similarly, there isn't really much agreement about what has happened. In fact, there isn't really much agreement about anything at all. There isn't much agreement about what's happening right now. And this fragmentation, this lack of cohesion, is becoming very, very granular. It's sort of felt in the texture of the minutes, right? So the fact that here we are now talking, and we are talking from different places, and we are talking to a particular audience that we have a general sense of, but not really. And someone might be watching this from anywhere in the world, from whatever circumstance. They might watch it on repeat later in a solitary sense. They'll be watching it alone and not really having any sense, even a digital sense, that they're sharing it with anyone else. And that's just become ubiquitous, the way we consume our news, the way we, even if we belong to a group of people that we all get the news from the same place, we're not getting it in the same way at the same time. We're not focusing at the same thing. I think all of that has really, the impact of it on our imagination is really profound, and has created a sense of a sort of poverty of belonging, right? It's very difficult to think of who am I part of, you know? And I think it's excited. I'm not trying to simplify all the various complex forces around this tendency to focus on particular things, on my identity, on, you know, I want to do this or that. But I do think it has excited this sort of sense of wanting to belong to a very, very particular group, and as well intentioned, I like to think it is, or at least as understanding as I like to think I am of it. It is a gesture of a narrowing of the heart. It's not the kind of solidarity that will imaginatively and also in forms of action, motivating me to cross a chasm, to go to someone else who might, on the face of it, not appear to be similar. And what Veronica said, this sort of the fantasy then also becomes, I can see that the fantasy also becomes for self-reliance, kind of I become rich and then I've solved the problem, as it were, you know? And I've become, as I was listening to Veronica, I was thinking how fascinating it is that right now you have this very powerful, just enthusiasm for royalty, right? in public in popular culture, because in a sense royalty is the the fantasy of royalty is that you are endowed by some kind of gift or some kind of good fortune or luck or money, and you could just do away with this business, right? So I think even that um, is a maybe indirect or subconscious acknowledgement that there's a real crisis of solidarity. Now,
sorry, go on.
sorry, am I speaking too much?
No, please go on.
I was just going to say now, no, that's sort of, that is the problem of at least how I see it from my perspective. But then where it is undercut, where this view of mine becomes complicated, is when I encounter, as I have been doing recently in Columbia University, when I encounter what students are doing, their appetite for a different kind of way of operating together. The fascinating thing about this moment is that solidarity has never been in a worse place, arguably. But I would also suggest that the appetite for it has never been more desperate.
That is fascinating, Hisham, because I think what you're pointing to is, at one level, the disappearance of a shared world, a common world. Partly due to also the fact that you also point out, the fact that so many of us come from so many different places. We are not in the context where our parents, where our grandparents grew up and had their homes and created their networks. We belong to this, much more expanded, enlarged global reality in which, the older inherited solidarities or communities are not available. As a result, in the United States in particular, people are very attached to a certain kind of identity politics, to people from, their ethnic community or religious community. No matter how, many decades separate them from that community, they will be attached to that. And you say that is the desperate longing for one kind of solidarity. But I think, again, that kind of solidarity is often limited to one's own group, to one's own ethnic, racial, religious sort of community. And that, again, does not avoid the problem of confrontation and conflict. Not that confrontation and conflict are bad in themselves, but again, what they do is really, in a way, dissolve the problem instead of solving it. So it's the rich, it's the plutocrats, it's the monarchs, it's the royalty class, as you put it, who enjoy solidarity among themselves, while everyone else is fighting on themselves and hurling, accusations of various sorts. And this is the scenario we are in right now. The one class that exemplifies perfect solidarity is the plutocratic class. Globally, whether it's Milei or Trump or Netanyahu or Orban, they're all together. Keir Starmer, they're all working to help each other, to support each other. And everywhere else is longing for solidarity, as you say, desperately longing for it, but is unable to achieve it except temporarily here and there in protest movements, in political campaigns. And that was, of course, Gandhi's big breakthrough, to bring people together from different, parts of India, with different ethnic groups or different religious groups, different linguistic groups, and to give them a political platform. But I actually would just very quickly turn to Veronica and ask her, because she mentioned indigenous peoples and their movements. Because I think the indigenous peoples, if I'm not mistaken about this, at least speaking from the experience of India, they have a very different conception, obviously, of the human individual, and do not see this human individual in any way as separate from other individuals, or for that matter, from the natural world. It's a much more holistic vision of that, and also a sense of fragility, a sense of transience, a sense of impermanence, which again is inherently opposed to this idea of expansion and endless life and endless growth, which all the plutocrats right now are completely devoted to. Are there possibilities within those particular traditions, is my question to you, Veronica, of coming up with some kind of a fresh basis for reconceiving social solidarity or political solidarity?
Yes, yes, for me that is crucial because, well, they are offering another idea of future, very much involved in other experience of past. And I think that is not by chance that the indigenous communities are in the front line of the criminalization because of the extractivist project, at least in Argentina, especially the Mapuches communities in Patagonia, but in other provinces are now targeted by the Elon Musk and Milei strategy for lithium extraction, for example. But I think that they are really in a position to offer another form of relationship. And also, I think this is the cause of why in Argentina, for example, it is now criminalized also different practices of solidarity with indigenous communities. Because I think that is at stake what they are offering as a way, as a project to recognize the territories, the landscape, and the memories of the earth as a concrete idea of wealth. So I think that is a very important point, but also because when I was talking before about how Milei is proposing to the young people this entrepreneurial dynamics of financial freedom as a sort of idealistic future, I think at the same time he's capitalizing and he's exploiting the idea of a non-really existing welfare state as a political memory. At least in some of our countries, this idea of a restoration of a welfare state is not a real political memory. So the ultra-right wing is really instrumentalizing and capitalizing this idea of non-universality of social rights, for example. So they are producing an appropriation of the critiques against liberal democracy, because they are saying, well, we all know that liberal democracy is false, that is not an universal schema of social rights, it is not a project of commonwealth. So we are now demonstrating that democratic procedures are completely false. So I think that other kind of political memories, other kind of uses of other past that are not related with this progressive, non-universal welfare state are nowadays at stake. How we can mobilize other images of future that are connected with other experiences of the past. And for me, this is a crucial thing nowadays, because as Hisham was saying, I feel also this desire for other political imagination in the young people, for example. And is desperate how the ultra-right wing is trying to fill that with this content of financial freedom, for example. So I think that we have to, yes, reopen up with other vocabularies and other, yes, images of the past, the imagination of future, a possible future.
There's also, I suppose, another kind of solidarity which is on offer, which has been on offer since the late 19th century, which is the solidarity built around feeling hatred of and a feeling of superiority over your ethnic racial inferiors. That is what is on offer to, for instance, the white working classes in Western Europe and the United States, that no matter how much you may be struggling, but you're still above these people who are trying to get into your country and trying to cross the Mediterranean. So racism as a form of solidarity, what was described famously as the wages of whiteness, and that is also in a way the sort of very insidious use of solidarity, an offer of political community to isolated people, to people who are suffering out there. And again, it just sort of goes on to underline the importance of creating a different basis for solidarity. I mean, often struck by, maybe Kohei will have an answer for this, how of the three sort of principles that inaugurate the modern world, equality, liberty, and fraternity, fraternity has really been not given that much attention. We've devoted so much more attention to the idea of equality and to liberty. But the fraternity aspect, now that we are speaking, I just think it's been so little explored, so little theorized in many ways. I mean, not that you should really speak about Japan from the experience of your experience living there, but I'm always curious about how the Japanese have conceived of this relationship, and how they've conceived of fraternity and solidarity, and what is also the position of the young there, because as far as I can see it from my visits to the country, that the Japanese youth are in a completely different world altogether than from the rest of us.
Especially compared to the US one. But yes, so one of the reasons that makes it really hard in Japan to imagine a better future is basically that economy is stagnating and population is now decreasing. So the younger generations are, of course, the smaller portion. That means that their voice are not reflected in the election results. So the young people are very much disappointed that they don't think they can change the society by raising the voices and they, starting the new movements and so on, because the current system of democracy basically functions for the older generation. So they think that this democratic system itself is the part of the problem, and that creates some kind of conservative turn. Maybe racism or like a fraternity, the idea of fraternity becomes quite particular, that they just try to preserve their own self-interest. So the Japan is becoming, in a sense, more and more conservative, even though they have to simply accept immigrants for the sake of sustaining some level of civilization in the future. They don't want to have immigration, and they don't want to build a better relationship with other East Asian countries like Korea and China. And this really created some kind of the stagnation. And then the issues such as climate change is interestingly not the main concern of the society, even though it is one of the most vulnerable countries to the typhoons and the other heat waves and those negative impacts of climate change. So what's actually happening in Japan is they are afraid that, especially the younger generation seems to be afraid that if they try to change the society, not simply they're pessimistic that they cannot change the society, but even if they could, if they try to change the society, it might even accelerate the degradation of this Japanese decline. So they become, in this moment when they know that the future is going to be bad, they try to at least minimize this speed of the degradation. Or once they recognize that they can no longer avoid the decline, they start thinking about preserving their own self-interest instead of thinking about how we can create some kind of universal freedom, equality, and fraternity, and so on. So that might be some kind of like representation for the future societies, also in the global north, because these European countries are also now, the economic growth is starting to stagnate, especially Germany, and then the population is also starting to decline. So Japan is some kind of ahead of capitalist development. So after the end of progress, it's going to decline. But then when these things start to decline, it's not the case. Marx imagined that after this kind of problem becomes worse, the people will stand up and try to change the system for building some better future. But at least if you look at the situation in Japan, the situation gets worse, and then people become more optimistic, more conservative and egoistic, and so on. So it's really what I have been trying to do, especially in Japan, is to create a narrative of imagining a better future. Like degrowth was my project, right? Basically, that the Japanese economy is no longer growing, but maybe that's not a bad thing because we can create something better even without depending on this continuous growth and so on. But yeah, in reality, it seems that we will have more of populism, conservative desire, xenophobia, and so on. And I think what's really happening, what's accelerating this tendency is creating false desire by some kind of techno-capitalism, right? Today we haven't talked about it, but this kind of like digital technology really creates a space where all those negative desires like hatred, anxiety, and anger are really maximized and creating some enemies and then really mobilizing people in a negative way. And I think that that's really negative tendency that's really hard to fight against because they are so deep penetrating into all the aspects of our lives and our desires are starting to be manipulated by AI and so on. And how can we create some more progressive desire for solidarity and desire for emancipation? I have to say, I mean, capitalism is not good in a good shape either. I mean, they are dependent on this kind of like Trump and like right-wing populist and even authoritarian regime. It's a sign of weakness, obviously. But at the same time, the progressive side is also in a deep crisis. So in this double crisis of capitalism and the counter movement, I cannot imagine something better coming out of this situation, at least for now.
That takes us actually to the first of our question from the audience. Sorry, I should have mentioned that you're all free to post questions in the chat box here. And this question, the first one, is actually really questioning all our assumptions here. It says, has progressivism really failed? Think of all the progress on women's rights and racial justice over the past several decades, despite conservative efforts to roll them back. Shouldn't we focus on progressivism's accomplishments and how to build on them? Veronica, do you want to take this?
Yes, this is why I was mentioning the struggles of the at least last decade at the beginning, because I think that if we consider this moment as a counter-revolution against those, well, we can decide if called progressive or not progressive struggles. And I think that I would like to mention that these struggles are forms of connecting structural violence and proposing other ways of belonging, other ways of dealing with precarity, and other ways of assuming interdependence. So in that sense, they are at the same time, for me, anti-progressive in the capitalist sense, and they produce a sort of accumulation of images of political technologies, of struggles against neoliberalism, against racism, against patriarchalism that are still with us as tools, as as a political accumulation. And I think that nowadays, for example, what is happening with the solidarity around Gaza and all the struggles around Palestinian struggles are incredible, a new wave of internationalism from below that we have to learn a lot about. So I think that also the struggles at the universities nowadays, the struggles in different indigenous communities, but also the struggles around new issues of labor in migrant spaces are ways of reshaping this internationalism from below. And also, I think that they are part of a very interesting constellation that is very much involved with the political accumulation of the last decade, at least.
Yeah. But in that sense, I mean, I suppose the sheer sort of moral ugliness of ruling classes around the world has alerted many young people in the way they didn't to previous generations, just how corrupt, hollowed out, unrepresentative these political and economic systems have become. And for young people, I think it's come as a sort of great shock, just how much violence, how much corruption actually lies behind these systems. So you're right. I mean, I think in that sense, their internationalism, Hisham talked a little bit about it, represents a kind of hope in at least modest quantities at this point. There are several other questions. Okay, one is, isn't it wrong to blame progressive for the collapse of the progressive agenda? Those in power, business and state elites, were always going to oppose it. And now they're utilizing the nationalist and populist rage at globalization to do so. What could progressives have done differently? It's a hard one. Hisham, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I think I must say I'm sort of on the side of these questions a bit, because I feel that one of the things that we must avoid is that in our desire for more meaningful, more constructive, more effective forms of solidarity, that we don't underestimate the gains, and we don't sort of take a stick to our own brothers and sisters, as it were. And so in thinking about it this way, I've been trying to think a little bit more about what we actually mean by solidarity. So when you mentioned, Pankaj, that solidarity is an argument, a very strong argument can be made that it's strongest and most vivid amongst the tyrants, or amongst those who are wielding power in an active way. I understand what you mean, but I don't think that's solidarity. I think, in my view, what's fascinating, when I think of what might be the opposite of solidarity, I think of a word like arson, for example, right? And I think that looking at the politics as being a politics of arson, whether what's happening in Argentina or in the US, or seems to me to make much more sense than it being, or in Hungary, as that these leaders are somehow finding brotherhood amongst one another. The fascinating thing about arsonists is that they see progress in breaking something, right? So it's not just the enjoyment of taking a chainsaw to things, but they actually see that's what progress is. And whereas I think solidarity is much more built on the hard work of creating connections. And what has really moved me, and I also think these students that I'm talking about are relying on, or at least have benefited from, in ways that might not always seem obvious to us, but I feel are very, very profound. They've benefited materially, they've benefited imaginatively, philosophically, from progressive politics, in allowing them to create links with one another across divides. One of the most heartening things at Barnard College and Columbia University where I work, is seeing how the most powerful front that is created by these students that have been subjected to terrible policies, absolutely terrible policies that have cost them a great deal and have made them suffer on a whole multitude of levels. The strongest bond has been between Palestinian and Jewish students. That has been the most consistent, the most articulate, the most effective. And so in my conception, at least, of solidarity as not fully formed as it is that it is a gesture of crossing a chasm. Solidarity isn't something that I create with my family, with my people with whom I share, whether economic or racial or religious features. Solidarity is really formed across divides in my view. And I think the trouble with our moment is that national formations dominate, yet our solutions are actually not national. They need to cross national divides, and that's something that is that is a weapon, if you want to put it that crudely. That is a weapon that regimes who are not interested in this kind of advancement wield very strongly, whether by closing borders or demonizing neighbors and so on. And I think it's not just, it is of course xenophobia and so forth, but I think it's also, on some level, they must understand that this is the best way to hold back progress, because whether it's the environment or whether it's democracy or whether it's economic justice, all of these things demand cooperation on a much larger level than within nation states.
Thank you, Shah. I mean, I think you went very beautifully into the heart of the matter. I mean, I think I would say I would add something more to your description of crossing the abyss, or crossing the chasm. When I use the example of the plutocratic, communities and the solidarity within those groups, what I was really implying is how a solidarity that is actually built upon mutual enrichment and mutual empowerment, that is the form it takes. If solidarity is going to be connected to individual self-aggrandizement, then this is the form it will take. Musk hanging out with Trump, and Trump hanging out with Marine Le Pen and various other far-right anti-Semitic demagogues around the world. The solidarity that you're defining, which, where people actually break out of their ethnic, racial, religious, ideological, linguistic prisons and reach out to others, I would say also it involves something very important, which is self-sacrifice. It doesn't actually involve self-aggrandizement in its truest form. It involves renunciation of certain parts of the self, including your identity, including your inherited identity. The other point you made about, state sort of thinking in national silos when all the problems require coordination, on a global scale by necessarily global institutions. One thing that comes to mind, one big problem, probably for some people, the biggest problem right now, climate change. And that's an example of a problem that cannot be solved by one nation alone, that actually require genuinely the solidarity of all the nations and all the peoples to solve this. And here, perhaps the underlying argument behind this conversation is that a recognition of human weakness, a recognition of frailty before this enormous problem can be the basis, can that be the basis of these nations coming together? The fact that the planet itself is doomed, it might be extinct, planetary life might be extinct very soon. Is that not enough to bring people together? I'm going to ask Kohei this question because he's sort of engaged with it in a sustained way. This question of environmental calamity, which now hangs over all of us, no matter where we are, whether that is not enough, that recognition of global infirmity, before the changes that human beings themselves have brought into being and accelerated.
So the future is going to be bad because of the accelerating climate change leading to climate collapse. And then obviously the weaker, poor people will be damaged. They will suffer more and first, even though they are least responsible for the situation. And that really reveal, I think, this future is dark in that sense. So we have to give up this idea of modern enlightenment, emancipation, and even universality, human rights, democracy. All those things just under the liberal democracy, all bullshit. I mean, they are not doing this. Really, this dark future, if there is any positive aspect, I think there is this revealing aspect of hypocrisy of liberal democracy. They don't actually care about human rights. This is just all full of a double standard, I have to say. The elite, liberal elites, I mean, it's the same as Trump, actually. The liberal elites also don't care about suffering and death as long as their interests are secure. And that's, I think, the general feeling from the global south and the younger generation, too. So I think that actually creates, of course, first it creates a deep crisis of modern enlightenment or the Western values of, as I said, human rights, progress, emancipation, and so on. But it might create the new conditions of thinking something truly universal or truly maybe even emancipatory. I don't know how I should put it at this moment, but that really, because I understand the dissatisfaction, anger, and anxiety, and all the feelings that the MAGA people have. So I think when Millet says liberal democracy is false, sometimes I agree with them. I mean, this is the truth. But of course, the solution itself is totally wrong. But I think this acceleration of crisis might open up some conditions for radically questioning what we have taken for granted. I mean, what we mean the progressive side, naively taken for granted, by actually participating in this structure of exploitation, oppression, and many bad things. So by really recognizing this structure, there might be the possibility that we build a new democracy based on how we are actually vulnerable, how we are, precarious, and that kind of aspect, of course, marginalized under capitalism, should be the basis of the new society. That's clear, but I think the problem is how we can imagine, create a new narrative based on that aspect. I think now it's very hard, but so we might have to wait. So the situation is going to be worse, but that doesn't mean that we should give up and then just, we're going to die and so on. I'm not saying that. I mean, we still have to fight, because if we don't fight, the weaker and the poor people will die first, and then that's just a acceleration of the injustice. So we have to keep fighting, but that must be something based on a very different principle than modern enlightenment.
Can I jump in, Pankaj?
Sorry, yeah, please go ahead, Veronica.
No, because while listening Kohei, I was thinking what kind of radical persistence of life could be the sort of ethic, but also the concrete force that is sustaining a sort of ethic of what we are doing. So of course, I was saying before, they are capitalizing this critique against liberal democracy as a false promise, and they are capitalizing also the limits of human rights and progressivism and so on. But they are doing that through this enjoyment of destruction. This is really clear in different aspects and in different experiences in our countries. So how we can oppose this radical persistence of life, I think, detach from these ideals of progressivism that is completely not an everyday experience for the majorities. I think this is a very important and crucial element to follow our discussions.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you, Hisham and Kohei. We've actually run out of time here. And thank you, everyone who attended this really fascinating, enthralling discussion, I would say. I would welcome all of you who tuned in for this webinar to also tune in for our conversations in Rome next month, which would be live streamed. We've got a packed program of 2 days, and you can find all the details on the Georgetown Global Dialogues website very soon, I think. So yes, hope to see you all there, and thank you again for joining us this morning.